A solitary rancher purchased a mute girl from her intoxicated father. Little did he know what she truly perceived. Chapter 1. The Market Town, Texas. 1881. The dying autumn sun scorched the weathered planks of the frontier settlement. Livestock shuffled restlessly while traders shouted their final offers through liquor-stained breath and dust-caked boots. The season's last cattle sale was drawing to a close, yet curious onlookers remained clustered around a pen where a chestnut mare trembled, her ribs protruding sharply beneath scarred hide. Silas Carrion pulled his hat low against the harsh light, maintaining his characteristic silence. At 35, he embodied the harsh landscape that had forged him a man more comfortable with solitude than society. Town visits were reserved for necessities, provisions, and livestock. The mayor had caught his attention earlier, and he'd returned as the crowd thinned. His worn boots struck the hard-packed earth rhythmically as he drew closer. That's when his gaze fell upon her. A young woman barely past 18 stood motionless behind the wooden rails. Tangled hair clung to her face, her tattered dress hung in strips, and bare feet bore layers of prairie dust. She remained utterly still. No words, no tears. Her vacant stare seemed to track invisible phantoms while a drunken man beside her clutched a bottle in one fist and a length of rope in the other. The rope wasn't tethered to any animal, it bound her wrist. Got myself a useless one, the intoxicated fool bellowed to anyone within earshot. Birthed by my late wife, I reckon. Can't speak a lick, can't hear neither. But she scrubs, prepares meals, never argues back. Going cheap. Several men snickered cruelly. Someone spat into the dirt. Silas started to turn away. He'd come for horseflesh. Nothing more. Then something stopped him cold. Not a sound or plea, just a look. The girl's eyes had found his face. No desperation marked her features, no begging in her posture. Simply gaze, crystal clear and unwavering. Within that steady look lived something he hadn't encountered in years' recognition. Perhaps a reflection of his own isolation. The drunkard staggered closer. You carry coin? Want this nag? She's part of the deal. Ain't hauling her worthless hide back home. Not worth the dirt under her nails. Silas paused. The mare snorted, foam dripping from her muzzle. The girl's stare never wavered. He faced the drunk directly. I'll purchase them both. Immediate harsh laughter erupted from nearby men. You collecting animals or building a harem, Silas? Someone jeered. Silas ignored them, counting coins into the man's grimy palm. Enough for horseflesh. Insufficient for a human soul. The drunk jerked the rope forward, but the girl recoiled, instinctively stepping behind Silas for protection. She belongs to you now, the drunk slurred. Don't claim I never warned you she ain't worth the food she eats. Silas removed the rope. Tossing it back, he led the mare from the enclosure while the girl followed with careful, measured steps. She possessed nothing except a threadbare shawl draped across her shoulders. At his wagon, she halted, waiting silently. He opened the rear gate and gestured for her to climb aboard. She complied, curling herself into the corner like someone accustomed to invisibility. As he settled onto the driver's seat, the faintest touch grazed his coat. Looking down, he saw her small, work-worn fingers had brushed his sleeve just once. She wasn't looking at him now. Her attention rested on the distant ridges, but in that single contact he sensed something profound. No gratitude, no pleading, just a moment where she chose to place her trust in him. Here was Silas Carrion, a man who conversed more with horses than humans. Living alone on 200 acres of red Texas earth, with only fence posts for companionship, and unnamed wounds from his past. And now, a girl who couldn't hear, a girl who might comprehend more than anyone had ever imagined. He clicked the reins. The wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding against the hard-pan trail leading from town. Behind him, she sat wrapped in a blanket, face turned toward the breeze. She never glanced backward, neither did he. Chapter 2, A New Beginning, The Wagon Wound. Through twilight and dust, threading between rolling hills and scattered mesquite, until the fields expanded and the heavens opened into that vast Texas emptiness. Silas's spread wasn't impressive, simply a main dwelling with a crooked roof, several outbuildings, an endless prairie where cattle wandered beneath infinite skies. Yet it possessed tranquility and cleanliness, and for a man like him, it had always sufficed until this moment. He assisted the girl down from the wagon, uncertain whether she might flee or freeze, but she stepped gracefully to earth. Her eyes surveyed the landscape, not fearful, merely observant, as if memorizing everything without seeking permission. Within the kitchen, Silas stoked the flames and indicated the kettle. She nodded and approached without hesitation, locating tin cups and ladle as if she'd always belonged near hearth and hunger. Still, not a single sound escaped her lips. Following their meal, he retrieved chalk from the cupboard and tapped the wooden doorframe beside the table. "Name," he said deliberately. She studied him momentarily, then knelt beside the frame. With delicate fingers, she inscribed a single name in flowing, slanted letters. "Imlane," he read once, then repeated, "Imlane," he spoke aloud, testing how it felt on his tongue. She offered no smile, simply turned and disappeared into the shadowed barn. Come morning, Silas discovered her in the stable, crouched beside the same battered mare. The horse had barely touched food since the auction, its rear leg swollen from old injuries. Imlane drew a damp cloth along the mare's side, communicating through touch rather than words or signs, just the careful rhythm of someone who listened. With palms and breath, Silas remained in the barn doorway, arms crossed. He'd witnessed seasoned ranch hands receive kicks for less. But the mare stayed calm, trembling only slightly, allowing the girl to wrap its leg with quiet patience. Perhaps she couldn't hear, but she certainly understood. That day Silas assigned her simple tasks: scrub the floorboards, boil water, clean the tack room, without complaint, without questions, without making a sound. Each evening he left chalk for her. She would inscribe notes in the margins of their shared world: bacon running low, dog favoring left paw, wind carries dust scent. They never conversed, but the quiet didn't feel hollow until the tempest arrived. Chapter 3. The storm's warning. It began, like most Texas storms, slowly and deceptively. A warm breeze rose around sunset, caressing the long grass like a whispered warning. Silas glanced skyward, noting distant clouds gathering, but dismissed them. He was checking cattle in the shed when she appeared. Imlane, barefoot, hair wild, breathing rapidly but soundlessly. She seized his sleeve and pulled urgently. "What?" he asked, startled. She pointed upward, hands trembling, eyes conveying what her voice could not. "Danger." Now he hesitated. My examination of a sick calf. But something in her expression galvanized him into action. She tugged again toward the barn door, away from the corral. Then it struck. Not a crack, a shattering. Reality split as lightning plunged from the heavens, striking the massive oak looming behind the cattle shed. The blast shook earth beneath their feet. Sparks erupted. The ancient tree exploded into flames and toppled with a groan that sounded like sky weeping. Silas stumbled backward. Calves bleated in terror. Smoke spiraled toward the clouds. He looked at her. Imlane stood frozen just beyond the doorway, face illuminated by flickering fire, eyes steady, chest heaving. She had known, not guessed or sensed after the wind shifted. She had known before thunder, before atmospheric change. Silas approached her slowly, still half in shock. "How did you?" But she only gazed at him, silent, certain. That night, after extinguishing the fire and calming the animals, he sat beside her at the kitchen table. No chalk this time, no words, just a man with hands on wood and a girl who couldn't speak. Yet somehow she had perceived something no one else could. Not thunder, not wind, but the warning within the world itself. For the first time in years, Silas realized he wasn't truly alone. He studied her hands folded in her lap. "Imlane," he said again. She lifted her eyes to meet his. Silence answered, and it was sufficient. Chapter 4. Deeper understanding since the storm. Silas had begun paying closer attention, not with suspicion, but with the quiet fascination of a man who'd lived too long in solitude and now faced something beyond explanation. Imlane never spoke, never signed, never wrote beyond her name. No books, no formal education, no words. Yet there were days when she seemed to understand more than anyone he'd ever encountered. One morning when the lead cow stood isolated in the pasture, refusing food, Silas attributed it to cold weather. He made a mental note to observe her, but Imlane moved without delay. She brought straw to the birthing stall, drew mint-infused water from the well, and stood beside the cow, stroking her belly in slow, measured circles. By sunset, the cow was in labor. She had known. Somehow she had known. Silas said nothing, but he watched her closely. Sleep eluded him that night. The following day brought new challenges. Returned from town carrying tension in his shoulders. Burdened by old ghosts, Sheriff had spoken in half-truths and warnings about land claims, whispers that his father had seized more than rightfully his during wartime. Bloodshed, displacement, guilt, none of it was new, but it never stopped. Stinging, he shared none of this with Imlane. Yet when he sat on the front steps, staring into falling dusk, she appeared beside him. She didn't speak, simply placed her hand on his shoulder, light as breeze, steady as breath. After a long moment, Silas muttered, "How did you know I carry shame about this land? Shame regarding what my father did to keep it." Imlane's dark eyes searched his face. Then slowly, she lifted her hand and placed it on his chest, directly over his heart. Afterward, she turned and walked toward the old oak where his father's grave rested silent beneath Texas sky. She'd never read the headstone, never asked questions, yet she knew at night Silas tossed restlessly, sweating through dreams of cannon, fire, and scorched hills. His father's voice emerged through smoke, rough, proud, trembling. "I gave you the land, Silas, and I gave you the blood on it." Silas woke with a start, breathed loud in the stillness, and saw her. Imlane sat in a chair, by the hearth. She'd lit a single candle. In the flickering light, her profile looked carved from shadow and grace. On the table beside the candle lay a blue handkerchief, faded, trimmed with hand-stitched lace. His mother's. Silas hadn't seen it in a decade. It had been locked away, in a cedar chest. No one else knew of its existence. He sat up. "How?" Imlane didn't look at him. She rose soundlessly and walked to the door. No explanation was needed. She had heard something no one else could, not words or memories, but pain, grief, the silent weight of guilt pressed between ribs, the aching sound of a man's heart breaking when pride prevented its expression. In her quiet, she answered. She heard, for the first time in Silas's life, he feared not for his land, legacy, or soul. He feared losing the one person who knew his feelings before he ever voiced them. Chapter 5. Growing suspicion. The first whisper originated from the blacksmith's wife. "She stares too long at the cattle," she said, folding breadcloths under her porch, voice low but sharp as wire, like she knows which one will drop next. By week's end, the preacher's son had added fuel to the fire. "She touched our goat," he told a circle of eager ears. 2 days later, it birthed too early. That ain't natural. No one had ever heard Imlane speak, and the fewer words she offered, the more the town seemed determined to fill her silence with fear. At the general store, a woman pulled her child behind her when Imlane passed, though she'd only come for flour. At the post office, someone spat near her feet. Most days, she kept her head down, never flinching. But Silas noticed how her fingers gripped the basket tighter, how her footsteps became softer, as if trying to vanish from ground that refused to forget. He never mentioned it to her, and she never asked why the world couldn't tolerate quiet kindness. But one afternoon, when a ranch hand's boy fell ill with burning fever, red-faced and convulsing in sleep, wasn't the doctor who came? It was Imlane. She moved softly into the barn where the child lay. Without seeking permission, she knelt beside the cot, placed hands on the boy's chest and forehead, and closed her eyes. Upon opening them, she walked outside. Cut 3 herb varieties from Silas's drying wall: lavender, feverfew, and rabbit tobacco, and returned with heated cloth. The boy drank the steeped leaves silently. By sunrise, he sat up hungry once more. His mother wept, grasping Imlane's hand with trembling gratitude. Yet the next day, she could be heard whispering at the well. She never asked about symptoms. How did she know? How did she know? Fear was no longer whispered. Chapter 6. The confrontation 3 days later, they arrived with torches and lit, but carried like promises. 8 men and women, boots stirring dust, stood at Silas's ranch gate. The eldest among them, Mr. Withers, whose own daughter hadn't spoken to him in years, stepped forward. "We want her gone," he declared. "That girl hears things she shouldn't." Silas stood in the barn doorway, arms folded across his chest. Unshaven for days, his face was hard as the timber framing behind him. "She's mute," he stated. "That ain't the same as deaf," Withers snapped. "She sees what's coming before clouds even gather. She talks to animals like they respond. A steer of mine died last week, and she was the only one who'd touched it. Think she cursed it? I think she's cursed, period." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Beside the house, Imlan stood behind the curtain. She'd heard gravel shift under their boots, seen their faces twisted, not with hatred, but something worse, certainty. She moved toward the door, but Silas raised his hand. He stepped forward, boots sinking slightly and thawing mud, and faced them squarely. "She saved a child's life. She caused his fever in the first place," a woman spat. Silas didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. "The only person I know who truly listens," he said. "Not with ears, but with hands, with breath, with her entire soul." The crowd stilled. "I've lived 35 years, he continued, voice low but unwavering. "I can count on one hand the people who genuinely heard me, not just words, but silences, regrets, grief." She did, without saying anything. He turned slightly, eyes sweeping over them. "You want to drive someone away for being different, for seeing the world you're too frightened to face? Fine, but you'll have to go through me." Withers opened his mouth, then closed it. No one moved. Slowly the crowd dispersed, torches unused, boots heavy. That night the ranch lay silent, except for wind. Inside, Imlan placed warm cider on the fire, then moved beside Silas at the table. She didn't sign, write, or even look at him. But after a moment, she reached out, resting fingers on his hand. It wasn't gratitude, it was recognition. His palm upward, curling fingers gently around hers. Together in the stillness, they listened to crackling wood, night's hush, and the bond growing between two souls that never needed words to communicate. Chapter 7. Love blooms December's 1st. Snowfall arrived quietly, like someone spreading a blanket over all that had burned or broken. Imlan stood by the log kitchen window, fingers threading needle through fabric, scraps leather patches, wool cuffs lining from an old coat Silas no longer wore. She was crafting a cloak, not for herself, but for him. She didn't need to hear. Wind to know bitter cold approached. Silas observed her from the barn door. She moved with purpose, every motion deliberate. In the week since townspeople had turned away, and he'd chosen to keep her there. His world had found rhythm again. She brewed coffee each morning before sky turned gray. She lined the chicken coop with pine needles. She brushed horses in slow circles and trained yearlings using gestures no cowboy had ever thought to try. He'd never seen animals respond that way to anyone. She would stand motionless, just long enough for a skittish foal to inch closer, then raise a single hand slow and open and wait. Somehow, they always listened. The silence around the ranch no longer felt like loneliness. It felt like listening. 1. Late afternoon, Silas rode toward the ridge, checking fences before the storm they both sensed coming. Light had just begun dimming when his horse startled loose rock maybe, or sent on the wind and reared. He was thrown hard, landing shoulder first, on frozen earth. Breath rushed from his chest. For a moment he felt nothing but throbbing pain where his arm struck a jutting root. He staggered upright, bleeding from the elbow. Sky was deepening rapidly. He wrapped cloth around the wound and tried walking, but each step sent sharp pain. through his ribs. When he stumbled into the yard, last light had faded. Emmeline burst from the cabin before he could knock. She had felt it perhaps just known. One of those strange, uncanny instincts no one could explain. She helped him inside, seated him by the hearth, and peeled cloth from his wound with gentle fingers. Her brow furrowed as she worked. She brought water, cleaned the gash, and pressed a poultice of yarrow and pine sap against it. He watched her. He whispered. She met his eyes. Then, without warning, she lifted his hand to her face and pressed her lips soft, warm against the wound's edge. Silas stilled. Fire crackled, and the room seemed to hold its breath. Emmeline didn't speak or smile, but something passed between them, like a door opening in the quiet. Later, as storm clouds gathered and snow-dusted window panes, Silas sat across from her at the table. He'd taken paper from his desk drawer and written, slowly, carefully, each letter shaped with meaning that couldn't be spoken aloud. He turned it to face her. "I want to hear your heart," it read, "if you'll let me listen with mine." She studied the words for a long time. Then her fingers reached out and touched them one by one, as if feeling truth inside the ink. When she finally raised her eyes, they were wet, but not from sorrow. She reached across the table and touched his chest just once, just enough. Then, for the first time since entering his life, she smiled. Not a polite smile, not one of fear or gratitude, but a smile like sunrise, like something breaking free after being held too long. Outside wind howled, but inside that cabin, a silence deeper than words had found its voice. It was warm, and it was real. Days softened. Winter still gripped the ridges, but between storms, life returned slowly. So did something else, something quiet and steady between Silas and Emmeline. She taught him sign language. Water, fire, thank you. Her fingers moved like branches in wind. Though he fumbled, she never laughed, only touched his hands, guiding them until he understood. He taught her to ride. She'd never sat a saddle before. The first time, she clung to the horn, knuckles white, but he walked beside her, speaking low. Though she couldn't hear, she moved with the horse anyway, sensing its rhythm through her bones. They built a small room off the cabin, part shelter, part refuge. There they shared meals in silence by the fire. Words weren't necessary, glances said, more than language could. He noticed things. She smiled when birds gathered at dusk. She flinched at sudden pops in the fire. She always knew a storm. Before it came, one night he spelled a sentence in shaky signs. "You make this place complete." She stared, then touched her fingers to his lips. Not a kiss, just acknowledgement. A way of saying, "I hear you too." Then came the storm. Silas had fallen asleep by the fire after repairing fences all day. The sky had been calm, no warning. The lantern flickered low. He woke to her hand on his shoulder. "Emmeline." She pulled his coat and pointed toward the barn. Outside, wind had shifted. Clouds raced past the moon. The air felt wrong, electric. In the barn, horses thrashed. Emmeline moved through them like wind, touching each flank, calm and certain. A loud crack overhead. Silas looked up a beam split. "We need to move them," shouted, but she was already leading the mare out, signing rapidly, "Roof will fall now." Together, they moved the horses to shelter near the house. Rain hammered the roof like fists. Just as the last animal cleared the door, the north beam gave way. The roof crashed where they'd just stood. Silas turned. Emmeline stood watching the barn collapse. Hair soaked, chest rising. She remained grounded, part of wind and rain, not separate from it. "How did you know?" he asked. She touched her chest, then pointed to the sky. He understood. She felt it. Later in the cabin, he handed her a blanket and sat beside her. He took her hand and spelled, "You belong to this land." She smiled, then placed his hand on her chest, over her heart. For the first time, he felt her rhythm quiet, steady. She didn't hear like others. She heard deeper. And Silas, in that moment, knew he had finally been heard too. Chapter 9. Acceptance and recognition, wine that once carried whispers now brought footsteps, hesitant, then trusting. Something had shifted in the town beyond Silas's fences, not loudly, or suddenly, but in silence, as most real change begins. The first was Tom Weaver, a ranch hand with a torn shoulder. The doctor was traveling east, and no one else knew proper wound care. He arrived one gray morning, reins in one hand, the other. Arm limp, Silas spotted him from the porch. "What do you want, Tom?" Tom nodded past him, to where Emlane knelt by the herb patch. "Heard she fixes things quietly." Silas gave a slow nod. "She does." Emlane came without a word. Examined the arm, hands steady, brow creased in thought. She moved as if listening not to words, but to something deeper. When she pressed the right spot, Tom winced, then sighed. 2 days later, a widow came. She hadn't slept in weeks. Emlane sat with her at dusk, hands gently resting on her shoulders until the shaking stopped. The next morning, the woman returned with pie and a hand-knit scarf. "For the girl," she said, "the one who hears more than we do." That winter passed. With fewer raised voices, fewer names spat in fear. Silas and Emlane lived as before quietly. But now, passing townspeople tipped their hats. Some left preserves by the gate. Each morning, Emlyn wrote on the chalkboard beside the kitchen. "Today will be good. I can feel it." Sometimes she was wrong, but most days she was right. Slowly, people believed it. Then came the Sunday that changed everything. Frost had just lifted. The church bell rang, and before its echo faded, panic spread. The 7-year-old boy had vanished from his family during morning chores. One boot was found near the tree line. Nothing more. Men shouted, mothers cried, dogs barked. When Silas and Emlane heard, he reached for his coat. Emlane, already beside him, placed a hand on his arm, then knelt. She pressed her hands to earth palms, wrists, her whole forearm. Then she crawled forward, pausing, tracing subtle marks, a shifted pebble, a broken twig. She stood and walked. She didn't look back, but they followed Silas. Then Tom. Then others through thickets, up ridges, down dry creek beds. Until in a cedar grove clearing, they saw him. The boy curled beneath a bent tree, ankles swollen, face streaked with dirt, and tears Emlane ran. She knelt, checked his leg, brushed hair from his eyes. Then she looked up at Silas, not proud, not triumphant, just relieved. When the boy was safe and the story retold, no one called her strange. They called her what she truly was, the girl who hears with her heart. Epilogue, a life complete wind. Moved slowly that evening, brushing gently over tall grass, like it remembered every name ever whispered on this land. Years had passed. The ranch still stood, weathered, wiser, wrapped in the steady rhythm of an unhurried life. Silas walked a little slower now, and Emlane's hair had grown long with silver threads. But neither kept track of years and numbers. They counted time in seasons, in moments held quietly between two hands, in the soundless way a heart says, "I'm still here?" Children came most mornings from town, from the edge of hills, from places where words were often thrown too fast or forgotten too easily. Here they found something else. They learned to listen not with ears, but with their whole being. They sat with Emlane in the garden, as she taught them to know. The difference between fear and shyness in a rabbit's twitching nose.
Ow.
They stood beside her in the stable and watched her place a single hand on a horse's flank, calming it with nothing but breath. She didn't teach with rules. She taught with silence, and with the rare, precious way she smiled when they understood something without having to say it aloud. Silas built a wooden bench beneath the cottonwood tree behind the house. That's where they sat most evenings, he and Emlane, shoulder to shoulder, watching the sun settle into hills. On those evenings, neither spoke much. They didn't have to. He would pour 2 mugs of tea, still warm from the kettle, and she would take his hand, thumb tracing slow rhythm across it. Sometimes he would bring out an old harmonica and play a tune with no name. She would close her eyes and sway as if feeling the song ripple through dusk. Then one evening, the shadows stretched across the wheat field and hush fell over trees. Imlane turned to him. She had learned a little speech over the years. Not much, just enough to read lips and shape a few careful words. Most days she still preferred her hands. But this time she spoke with her voice not used to being heard, soft as a leaf. Falling in snow, I do not need sound, she whispered. Only you. Silas blinked. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he nodded gently, throat tightening as he answered. I hear you. Always have. They stayed like that until the last light faded from the sky. The next morning, a new group of children arrived. Imlane wrote a sentence in chalk across the wooden slate nailed beside the front door. She did it every morning like a ritual. Today it read, "The day will be kind. I feel it." No one asked how she knew. They just believed her. When old folks in town talked about the girl who once could not speak or hear, they didn't whisper the word witch anymore. They called her the one who listens with her heart. Some still shook their heads in doubt, but most just smiled or nodded or came by with pie and stayed long enough to leave with something gentler in their chest. That winter, a boy got lost during a snowstorm. Imlane knelt in snow outside the barn, pressed palms to the ground, and tilted her face to the wind. Then she stood, pointed west. Silas followed her for 3 miles through pine groves until they found the boy, curled beneath a fallen log alive, frightened, but safe. They never questioned her again after that. The final scene of the year found Silas and Imlane walking together through the pasture. The sky was wide, brushed with amber and lilac. Her steps were slow, steady. A mare and her foal grazed nearby. The world was quiet but never empty. They stopped at the hilltop. Imlane turned to him, and for the first time, laughed at not. Loud sound, but a ripple of air that shook her shoulders and lit her face like dawn. Silas smiled and kissed her temple. No one told their story.
Ow.
It didn't need telling because it was still happening. Sometimes the truest love isn't shouted from rooftops, but the kind that walks beside you in silence every day and never asks. To be anything more than real, if your heart has ever paused for a gaze that understood without words, if you believe, love doesn't need a voice to be heard, only a soul brave enough to feel. Then the story of Silas and Imlane was meant for you. Out on the quiet plains of the American West, where wind and silence speak the same language, a lonely rancher and a girl the world called deaf discovered communication deeper than sound, a language of hands, of glances, of hearts that knew how to listen. Thank you for joining this journey with us. If stories of love that endures through prejudice, pain, and unspoken grace speak to you, subscribe to Wild West Echoes. Here love isn't just told, it's remembered, reclaimed, and echoes long after the last word fades. We'll see you again in the next story. Till then, may your quiet moments be full, and may someone always hear the heart you carry.